One of the most interesting things about Star Trek as a franchise, since it's been around so dang long, is how easy it is to define it by eras. And no, I'm not talking about eras like the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th centuries, you freaking nerds. No, but I'm talking about different eras of actual production in the real world, different times which Star Trek was produced over the years. And with some overlap, how each of those eras is defined by a particular style and people who worked on them. Because real nerds are the ones who spend way too much time researching behind the scenes information about an already incredibly nerdy show. And to be extra nerdy, let's define these eras by the people in charge. You have the Gene Roddenberry era, which goes from Star Trek's birth in 1966, all the way through Star Trek the Animated Series, all the way until Star Trek the Motion Picture, and then a tad further on the small screen into the first 2 or 3 years or so of Star Trek the Next Generation. Then you have what I will call the Harve Bennett-Nicholas Meyer era, from Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan until about Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country. Then you have the Rick Berman era, from Star Trek The Next Generation season 3-ish until Star Trek Nemesis and the cancellation of Star Trek Enterprise in 2005. And also there's whatever era this is.
In the middle of the earth, in the land of Shire, lives a brave little hobbit whom we all admire.
Now, this is a gross oversimplification, with numerous people helping to define Star Trek over the years, like writers D.C. Fontana, David Gerrold, and Gene Kuhn during what I called the Gene Roddenberry era. Or Leonard Nimoy as a director during the Harve Bennett years, or Michael Piller, Brandon Braga, and Ron Moore and Ira Stephen Bear during Rick Berman's tenure. But what's most important to know is that each of these eras, as I've defined them, are all sharing specific qualities and traits which are generally unique to them. Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise all have a lot more in common with each other than, for example, the original series and the motion picture. They're all Star Trek, to be sure, and they're all different refractions of the same beautiful ray of light that is the Star Trek ethos, but they all also have their own unique flavors. Which brings me to the modern era of Star Trek, which began with a little film called, Star Trek in 2009, directed by one J.J. Abrams, and continues all the way through all the Kelvin films, and into Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, as well as the upcoming Star Trek Strange New Worlds and Lower Deck show, and whatever the heck the Nickelodeon show is going to be called. All of these productions, which to keep consistent with my oversimplified naming structure, will be called the J.J. Abrams Alex Kurtzman era, have a ton more in common with each other than with earlier eras of Star Trek, for example. Though, in my opinion, they're all still Star Trek. Now, as anyone who has followed my channel for any length of time knows, I will go to bat for this current era of Star Trek any day. I believe the Star Trek that we have now is truly beautiful and unique, and still reflects the same optimistic light of Star Trek in a slightly different way. But like all of Star Trek, I think there are things that have become hallmarks of modern Trek's era that I don't really like as much. Things that I see across all productions in this era that I want to take time to critique and discuss here. And not in a
take down that dang Kurtzman destroyer of all things Star Trek
kind of way, but just to offer constructive criticism and engender discussion. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about all the negatives of modern Trek, which, as an admitted SJW, means that there are none. Actually, this modern era of Star Trek is totally perfect, and all of you can all go die if you disagree with me. No, I'm just kidding. There are actually negatives of Star Trek. Let's talk about it. One of my first critiques of this era is what I call escalation of scale. Everything in Star Trek since Star Trek 2009 has had to just be a little bit bigger and punchier than anything that came before it. At first, this wasn't a big deal, but still kind of noticeable. Like in Star Trek 2009, where we had the USS Enterprise somehow 10 times bigger than it was in the original series. Or Nero, the villain ship, being this hulking behemoth despite just being, a mining ship. And yes, I know it's from the future, and yes, I know that a comic book explained that it was Borg technology that had been augmented on the ship to make it this big technological behemoth, but that's just trying to justify the choice after the fact. It's clear that the people who made the movie just wanted the ship to look big and hulking. Now, these things didn't ruin the movie for me. It's clearly just read as someone saying, how can we make things more exciting? We'll make it bigger, of course. I'm not compensating for anything. It's not bad, it just felt kind of a little bit cynical. In that cynical Hollywood kind of blockbustery way. But the issue with this is that this kept expanding further and further in future iterations of Star Trek, moving beyond that simple cynicism. In Star Trek Into Darkness, for example, you had an even bigger ship that basically destroys all of San Francisco. Millions would have been dead, but in order to make that movie have a happy ending, this isn't acknowledged, but we wanted to have our big explodey ending, so there you go. In Star Trek Discovery, we have a gigantic battle at the end of Season 2 with millions of tiny ships and phasers and insanity going on, despite the good guys only really having 2 ships in that fight. And in Star Trek Picard, we have a fleet of 300 Romulan ships show up, only to basically act like one giant ship instead of splitting up like a fleet naturally would. And that brings me to the problem with this. This increasing gradations of scale pulls me out of the logic of the moment, and makes the stakes feel so large that they become unrelatable. This also goes for the actual stakes of the plot itself, not just the battles. Both Star Trek Discovery seasons and Star Trek Picard's first season end with basically all life in the Federation or the galaxy at stake. And while that's certainly fine to do every once in a while, I don't mind a little galactic destruction every now and then, constantly doing it over and over and over again just makes me feel kind of tired with it, and has diminishing returns every time you do it if you do it over and over again. Sometimes by having the stakes feel smaller, like in previous treks, it makes us more invested, like simply saving a ship, or even a single person. So that when you do have those galaxy-defining stakes, it feels noteworthy, not every day. Another issue I have with modern Star Trek is the kinetic camera movement. Now, I want to be very clear on this. I actually like a more emotive and movement-based camera that actually becomes a character in its own right. Often during earlier eras of Star Trek, the camera was just a passive observer, filming what was basically a theater play on TV from a neutralized distance point, kind of like my camera is right now. I'm on a stage, and the camera's not moving. It's not really commenting on anything that I'm doing. What's wonderful about today's television cinematography is that it has evolved to become much more like film, allowing the camera to comment on the story, to add something to the texture of it, rather than just showing us what's happening. But often, and especially in Star Trek Discovery, the camera movement doesn't feel motivated. It just feels like the camera's moving to move the camera. And I understand the limits of a TV production, where an episode is usually filmed over about a week or so, versus film productions, which can take months to film, means that you can't always have the most intentional or expressive of shot lists. Sometimes you just have to get the shots done, and that's all you have time for. But Star Trek Picard showed me that you can actually have shots, like this one that I'm hopefully showing in the screen right now, that actually highlights and comments on the action, like this one showing Picard's PTSD and past visually. And it actually adds to the emotion of the moment and comments on the action, rather than just doing something cool with the movement just to do it, which ultimately just becomes distracting. Speaking of distracting, needless things, modern Trek sometimes relies on pointless and atonal action sequences. Again, to be clear, I'm not against a good action sequence. I love John Wick, and I don't mind it in Star Trek. And I think Star Trek, and modern Star Trek in particular, has done some amazing action sequences. The destruction of the Kelvin in the opening of Star Trek 2009 is still one of the best action sequences in all of space-based science fiction, in my opinion. It moves the story forward, has emotional beats, and also showcases a unique visual style. But often in modern Trek, there's just some fight sequence or action set piece that isn't really necessary and feels over the top. Again, escalations of scale in there as well. It doesn't move the story along, it just happens to spice things up. Again, like the camera movement. You see kind of recurring issues here in terms of major themes going on. And to be fair though, this happened sometimes in other eras of Star Trek too, with scenes that just occurred with no point to them. But that was partially because of the limits of the medium, especially on television, though some of the Star Trek movies had this as well. Star Trek had to fill a 45-minute time frame, so often when you didn't have a story that fit exactly 45 minutes, some padding was necessary. That doesn't make it good, but sometimes there just wasn't much to be done. But today that excuse doesn't really work. Star Trek episodes can be any length they want them to be because it's all streaming. Heck, there is an episode of Star Trek Discovery that's only 38 minutes, and short treks are barely even 10 minutes. And that's totally okay with me. Take the time you need to tell your story, no more, no less. So just adding needless action just to hold our attention, like with the Escalations of Scale, is honestly just cynical. A good story captures my attention, and Discovery and Picard, to me at least, have shown that they can have good stories without resorting to cheap tricks. And all this goes into my next criticism: the using of canon to legitimize itself. Now, no, I'm not talking about canon and the way that a lot of people have used to criticize modern Trek in the sense that, oh my god, they ignored some minor aspect of canon that was in like Star Trek episode season 4, episode 2.
And how dare they get that wrong? So clearly people don't understand Star Trek.
That isn't to say if you like looking at the minutiae of canon and how everything ties together in big and small ways, that's a totally fine way to enjoy Star Trek, but it's not necessarily my way or the only way. But that's a whole other discussion that a YouTuber called Renegade Cut did a whole video on, and I'll link to it down in the doobly-doo because I think it's a really great discussion on that. But what I do take issue with is how modern Star Trek has often used ties to past iterations of the franchise in an attempt to legitimize itself. Well, for example, why did Burnham, Michael Burnham, the main character of Star Trek Discovery, need to be Spock's adoptive sister? It just felt like they did that, the writers did that, to say, hey look, she's Spock's sister. That means this is Star Trek because it's tied to the Star Trek you know. You know Spock. It's Star Trek, because Spock. You know Spock. Spock. I'm sorry. That wasn't even in my script. I just did that right now. So you're welcome, I guess. Anyways, moving on, Star Trek Picard in many ways is similar, basing its whole plot line around a character we knew from previous Trek, Picard. Now, both Picard and even Discovery totally made these choices work by building interesting stories around them, like with Spock's storyline in Discovery Season 2. But I also want the writers of Star Trek to know that it's okay to believe in your own ideas. I didn't fall in love with Michael Burnham because she was Spock's sister. I liked her on her own merits, and the fact that she was Spock's sister when it came into play in Season 2 of Discovery only enhanced the experience, but I liked her for her. The same with Saru, Tilly, Raffi, and all the other modern Star Trek characters, at least most of them. Trust your instincts, writers. Trust your own ideas. You don't need to tie yourself to other things to make me like them. I want to like the things you make too, not things that other people did and things that I've already fallen in love with. I want to fall in love with new things. That's what makes Star Trek fun. It's about exploring strange new worlds. And to be fair, these shows show signs of doing this. Discovery is moving into a brand new era that we've never seen before in the franchise, and Star Trek Picard has struck new ground even with characters we've known forever. And while the Captain Pike show, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, may be a return to classic Trek and rely on previously established characters, and I'm so excited and ready for that, I'm also ready to see where other shows go next too. Now, my second to last criticism of modern Star Trek is what I'm going to call space magic. Every little thing she does is magic. Every little thing just turned me on. That song's about sex, isn't it? The modern era of Star Trek has often relied on convenient space magic to enable its plot forward. I mean, what the heck is red matter in Star Trek 2009 besides this random thing that can do what we say it wants to do for the plot? Or the time crystal in Star Trek Discovery. And yes, I know Star Trek time crystals are a real thing, you freaking nerds. I've seen the Wikipedia page too, but they don't do the space magic stuff that they do in Star Trek Discovery. And let's not forget what I think is the most egregious example of this, the magic flute thing in Star Trek Picard Season 1's finale. Now, don't get me wrong, space magic isn't an issue with modern Star Trek only. I mean, the deflector dish in Star Trek The Next Generation can basically do anything, am I right? Whatever the plot dictates it wants to. That's basically space magic as well.
Transforming the deflector dish into an interplexing beacon.
Interplexing?
It's a subspace transmitter.
He's had it. Unless we put our deflector screen around him. Captain, if we try, we'll overload our own engines.
It may be possible to simulate a torpedo blast using a resonance burst from the main deflector dish.
The deflector dish in The Next Generation was just a regular part of the ship, so when it got used, yeah, it was space magic, but it felt a little bit more naturally incorporated most of the time. This isn't to say it was necessarily good writing, but compare that to Star Trek Picard, where the synth character literally gives Raffi the space flute and all but winks at the audience, this can do whatever you need it to do for the plot, so don't ask questions.
How?
You have to use your imagination.
My imagination?
It's just blatant, and it kind of bugs me. At least with the deflector dish stuff, or the weird technobabble, it was at least trying to be hidden, but here's just kind of in your face.
What's happening?
Nothing that makes any sense.
Now, writers should always look for a character-centric or scientific-based way out of a problem rather than space magic. But if you need to use space magic, which I understand happens sometimes, make it feel a little bit more naturally incorporated into the story. Like, for example, one of the ones that I would give for the Space Flute in Star Trek Picard, the only reason it was there was to create the hologram versions of Picard's ship in the final battle. Why not have him repurpose the tons of hologram emitters that were on La Sirena that we had seen throughout the season and say, oh, we're gonna use the hologram stuff to make these fake hologram versions of the ship. That, again, is still space magic and wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey, whatever crap you need it to do for the story, but it would have at least felt a little bit more naturally integrated. That's just my example. I'm sure there are many other examples that I could come up with. But this brings me to my final critique, and it's probably the most controversial. I don't like Star Trek to feel edgy and dark just for the sake of being edgy and dark. Now, this isn't me saying,
Modern Star Trek is too dark. I hate it because it ruined Gene Roddenberry's vision of an optimistic humanity. Kurtzman, I hate you. No.
For the most part, I've actually found the stories of Star Trek Picard and Discovery's first few seasons to be really thoughtful works, showing how we get from the darkness into the light. I don't necessarily hate when Star Trek gets dark and a little bit more cynical in order to deconstruct Star Trek as a whole. More serialized storytelling somewhat necessitates starting at a darker place than where you end, and the writers have used that in order to show us how we earn and hold on to Star Trek's utopian vision rather than taking it for granted. But always, in the end, reaffirming that humanity can and will be better in the future. That we will choose to do the right thing over the wrong thing.
We will not allow desperation to destroy moral authority.
That's the whole point. That's why we're here. To save each other.
The only time Star Trek tried to not have any internal conflict or any cynicism at all was during The Next Generation's first 2 seasons, and they might be arguably the worst Star Trek seasons ever made.
The challenge is unequivocally refused.
Then you shall have no treaty, no vaccine, and no Lieutenant Yar!
No, getting back to my original point, the issues I have with darkness and edginess in modern Star Trek is, again, somewhat smaller scale. There are small moments in modern Trek where it feels like the show just went dark just to say it's more adult and more mature. Like with the swearing in Star Trek Discovery.
You guys, this is so fucking cool.
So sorry.
Now, I'm not against swearing in Star Trek at all, not even a little bit. I'll even fight for the use of the F word in Star Trek Picard because I think it was effectively done to punctuate the moment that was going on. That sentence kind of got away from me.
Sheer fucking hubris.
But in Star Trek Discovery, it just feels like they did the F word just to do it.
Look at that. It is fucking cool.
Or back in Star Trek Picard when they have some really gruesome and violent imagery. And again, I'm not saying that they can't have gruesome and violent imagery. I think that, for example, in the scene where they showed the horrors of Icheb's torture and death in Star Trek Picard, but other times, it feels like the darkness and gruesome viscera that the show shows us feels like it could have been done without doing that. And feels like they're just doing it because hey, we can do weird viscera stuff on streaming now. And I think the writers of modern Trek have shown that they are capable of writing better than that. Just doing things because they can. So, to wrap us out, I want to make this clear, that I don't think that these issues overshadow or completely ruin modern Trek, at least for me. It's not as if previous versions of Star Trek didn't have their own issues. I mean, I've done a whole video on how Star Trek treated women up until Star Trek Discovery, for example. And I'd argue that the way they treated women, was a way worse issue of past Trek that in many ways kind of hurts those shows for me in certain ways, more than any of the issues that I mentioned in this video combined. These are just issues that I see constantly recurring in today's modern era of Star Trek that I think lessen the experience of watching Star Trek. And if these specific issues are things that mean that you don't like modern Star Trek, if one of these issues totally ruins it for you, that's totally okay. That's part of the joy of having a 50-year-old franchise. You have many different flavors to choose from, and it's okay to like one over the other, or not even like one flavor at all. No one goes into an ice cream shop liking and wanting every single flavor of ice cream. Except for me, who, I want every flavor of ice cream. Now I want ice cream.
Ice cream is the last thing I was expecting.
Oh, she's all about sugar. You have no idea.
Anyways, it's okay if these things ruin it for you, but they don't ruin it for me. And while I don't like them really and offer this critique in hopes that they might be improved upon if, some writer on Star Trek happens to watch this video, there's even an element of how these flaws in this particular era of Trek are part of the flavor that I enjoy. Sometimes the flaws are what make something beautiful, really. I mean, looking back at Star Trek the original series, for example, it had over-the-top acting and cardboard sets. And yes, those could be considered flaws that could have been improved with the show, but they're also part of the show's charm. So who knows? Maybe these flaws are also part of the charm of this Star Trek era as well.
Or maybe it's just that Kurtzman has ruined everything and needs to be fired like less than 40 over there, so it could be a little...
Shut the fuck up.
Well, those are the main negatives that I see about this modern era of Star Trek. But do you agree with me? Do you think there are more negatives? Do you think there are less? Do you think some of the negatives outlined are wrong? Let me know all that in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you want more videos like this, discussions on Star Trek or geek topics, or discussions of politics or social issues through geek topics, consider giving my channel a subscribe and hitting that little bell thingy so you don't miss any videos, because I make a lot of videos and I like people to watch them. And also, if you want to help make these videos even better, consider giving to my Patreon page, especially during our current worldwide crisis going on, and, you know, it's kind of hit me a little bit financially, so any help over on my Patreon really does mean a lot to me, especially right now. But regardless of if you comment, subscribe, or give to my Patreon, I'm just glad that you stopped by and hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially right now considering everything that's going on in the world. You keep me motivated and you help me continue doing this channel every single month. I could not do it without you. And a special thanks to my patrons, Polymena, Mystic the Monarchete, Bree Beecher, Din Hagney, Dante St. James, Anti-Cat808, Patrick Shannon, Wayne Twitchell, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Subraxis, Zach Cody, Maeve, Jason Knott, Maggie Evans, Christy Marie Johnson, Gavin Robinson, William Stewart, Michael Beam, Miranda Janelle, Mari Neckar, Lorena Mesa, Wellington Marcus, Susan Banks, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Ashley Allen Bociccio, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Stefan Schuhart, Greg Gillum, Christina Dalliance, Ashlyn Solstice, and Eli Bergmoss. Thank you to all of you.